Thank you everybody for joining us in this seminar today on improving our self-esteem. This is Dr. Andres Fonseca. With me today is Emily Cook, one of our business psychologists at Thrive. Emily, you want to say hi?
Hi there, how are you? Good afternoon, sorry, rather than good morning.
So I think the session will run for about 30 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I decided to be very practical, and my aim is for you to definitely walk away with some techniques that you should be able to apply immediately, or to sort of, if you know somebody that may be able to benefit from them. We are recording this webinar, and you should be able to sort of get access to it and send the link to anybody who you think might benefit from listening to it. Emily is going to be monitoring the chat and the question and answer functions. So if you, I think it's at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button there, or at the top maybe, a button labeled Q&A, so you can submit questions there. And she might be bringing in some of those questions if they're relevant to what we are talking about. So she'll be interrupting me from time to time, but also we will have time for Q&A at the end. So that's kind of the plan. What we're going to be talking about, let me see if this, yep, there we go. I want to cover these topics. Oops, I went too far. Yeah. So this is kind of a rough plan of what we're going to be talking about, and then at the end we're going to have like a recap going through the most important takeaway messages. So I'd like to start by talking about seeing ourselves in black and white. So through the conversations we've been having in the app, we've discovered that one of the main issues affecting people is low self-esteem. And obviously the flip side of that is perfectionism. And that is kind of setting ourselves impossible standards to measure up against. So there's a very clear link between common mental health conditions such as depression and poor self-esteem. And the link runs both ways. Poor self-esteem makes it more likely that you will develop one of these conditions. And there are conditions that will cause you to lose confidence in yourself, setting up potential vicious cycles that may be quite hard to disentangle. So this practical session will be taking a look at this particular issue, this particular vicious cycles that we may be setting up for ourselves. So I'm going to talk about how it could be useful to you, or how it might be helpful to somebody else, as I said at the beginning. And the first topic is this black and white that I mentioned at the beginning. So it's very easy, very common to see ourselves in this black and white terms. So we're either successful or a failure. We maybe see ourselves as beautiful or ugly, funny or boring, and so on. So this is common, but that doesn't make it right or even realistic. You know, those who think this way usually value themselves based on a few simple rules, such as, I don't know, the kind of job that they do, something like the amount of money that they make, the number of friends that they have, or maybe the way they look. While we may tell ourselves that any of these characteristics are important, none of them, if we think about it, is likely to be essential to feel good about ourselves. So that is essential quality. I want people to sort of focus on that as we go along. So scorekeeping, what do I mean by that? Well, any of these features, when any of them becomes the foundation for your self-worth, it can lead to fragile self-esteem. So it doesn't really matter what the feature is, as long as you see yourself through this lens, it will inevitably lead you to this scorekeeping that I'm talking about. So for example, if you start using any of these to keep score, you'll discover that no score is ever high enough. So you never successful enough, you never have enough money. There's always more that you can have. Or if you compare to others, yourself to others, there's always somebody more further along that dimension that you've chosen to value yourself up against. So for example, the simple the simplest one is, it might be money. It's important to keep tabs on how much you have in order to ensure that your needs are met. But there's no reason to think ourselves as successes or failures based on this. Life is very complex, and the amount of money one makes or has depends on many factors, many of which we have to realize we have no real control over. Even if we do very well by any standard, we'll always like to find ways to compare ourselves with, whoever you perceive as doing better than you. So you're going to set yourself up to play a forever losing game. So you're also likely to worry about losing whatever it is that you're pinning your self-worth on, so money in this case, as I said. So this scorekeeping kind of collapses who we are into maybe one dimension. So we understand our self-worth based on just one thing, or maybe a few things, and we strip ourselves of our three-dimensional beings. And this is, we do it so readily and so commonly, we don't even realize that we're doing it. So one of the biggest jobs that we have to do is to build a full picture of ourselves. So this is when the practical advice is going to start. So the first step is that you need to realize that there is an infinite number of ways in which we could be describing ourselves. So we need to actually know that we have many qualities, and actually achieve the sense of feeling that these qualities are valuable in different ways. So we may start doing this job by realizing that we are multidimensional beings, and I'll give you a few examples of how that works. But then the next job is to actually believe ourselves when we tell ourselves that these things are valuable qualities that we should take into account when appreciating our own self-worth. So when we struggle with low self-esteem, we sense that of what is valuable is distorted, and you may only see value in the things that people around you, including the media, deem important. This is where we tend to go wrong. So you probably know people that couldn't care less about, say, money, looks, being popular, or any of the other things that seem to motivate a lot of us. So regardless of your opinion of these individuals, they seem to be quite happy with who they are, and they don't need any of these things to feel themselves worthy. The lesson is that there is nothing objective about these yardsticks that we carry in our heads to measure our self-worth. So as we grow up, this is when it starts. We start to believe that in our society, only certain parts of ourselves are valuable. So this tends to start to come from the outside. This might come from maybe the attitudes of our parents sometimes, more frequently the media, maybe our peers as well. And as we learn this, we start to pay more and more attention to these qualities that are deemed, or we think are deemed important, and less to others. And when this process goes too far, we tend to internalize these values so deeply that we don't even notice that they come from the outside, that we just take them for granted. We believe this of ourselves. So sometimes it is enough to engage with people who are a few years older or younger than us, or talk to a few people from very, very different backgrounds, to find out how the things that we take for granted, or how the things that we believe are really, really valuable or really worthy, are just the products of our upbringing, culture, and circumstances. So I suppose the first task is to realize that all of these things, all of these ways of valuing ourselves, are in a way artificial. They're not intrinsic in any way. We don't need to believe that they are true. They do come from the outside. Other people use very different ways of looking at this. Why should we go for this particular way of looking at it, particularly when it's unhelpful to us? So one of the first jobs that we're going to sort of have to do is to try and discover what we actually value. So here's a list of common conditions, common things, that people value or that people used to value themselves, I should say. So seeing these as important, of course, is absolutely normal. But I think I would like you to take a few moments now to ask yourself if any of these at all is essential for you to feel good about yourself. And also think about what I said about, you know, how this is perceived by other people, particular people from a different background than you. Maybe children, you know, do they value these? Maybe much older people, do they value these? Maybe people from very, very different cultures. So is someone who doesn't have any of those, you know, worth any less than you, for example? Imagine that sort of circumstance, somebody who is perhaps being very disabled. Would you think that they are any less worthy than you? So why should you see someone who has whatever it is as a person that is more valuable than you, if that makes any sense? So if you're measuring yourself up against somebody who has more in that particular dimension, think about those who have less than you. Do you deem them less worthy? And would that be fair? And if that is the case, why do you deem yourself less worthy when you compare somebody that you perceive as having more of one of those dimensions? So how responsible might these people that are less fortunate than you of having less of these things, you know, how much you can attribute to them directly? For example, you might say that, you know, if you have a successful career, that you might have earned it, that you might have worked really hard. But if you think for a moment, you realize that even your career is the result of a combination of your genes, which you didn't make, your upbringing, which you didn't design, you know, you kind of landed where you landed, and the opportunities that you were given. So there's a long list of other factors that you didn't make. So yes, of course you work hard. Yes, of course you dedicated yourself, but ultimately a lot of other people may be just as hardworking as you are, etc., but may have not achieved the same level as you. And would you deem them less worthy based on that? So again, going back to what I said earlier, you also probably know people that could not care less about any of these things that I put in my list at all. And they don't see themselves defined by them in any way. And my question to you is, are they wrong? Are they wrong to see it in a different way? Okay. So we're going to talk, whoops, sorry, I went too far. Going to talk a little bit about acceptance. So even if you agree with me, I realize that knowing something, which is what I said at the beginning, is not necessarily the same as believing it. You know, someone's internalizing it. So we have to kind of cross that bridge from knowing something to be true and living our lives based on it. So everyone has areas in their life that they're not satisfied with, but for whatever reason, maybe they are unable to improve them. You, for example, may not be artistic, or may not have enough time for hobbies, or work out less than you want. In these situations, the best way forward is to accept that those limitations exist. And you need to sort of embrace the decisions that you made and embrace your own path. If you cannot really, if you truly cannot change it, if you're banging yourself up against the wall, the job is to come to realize that there are those limitations and to accept them and to tell yourself, then yes, it's enough. You know, what you're doing is as much as you can do realistically, and that has to be good enough for you. And it's linked with this idea that we ought to be a particular way. And maybe, again, this is something that got into our heads very early, that, you know, we incorporated from the media, from our parents, from our environment, our families, our culture. And we sort of have these rules about how we ought to behave, how we ought to be. And we need to sort of question that. So social expectations are arbitrary and will give us an oversimplified view of life and what truly matters. However, when we measure ourselves with these standards, we might find ourselves lacking. That's the problem. So this can be a real source of suffering and anxiety. So when you feel bad about yourself, you can easily convince yourself that the way out is to live up to this ought to be expectations, what these rules that you carry in our head. However, this way of thinking will likely set you up on a path of even greater suffering, is when you're not able to do that acceptance that we were talking before. We ought to be this way, why can't we? So even if you achieve whatever standard you start striving for, once you're there, you're likely to still feel dissatisfied and change the goalpost. This is very common. So we got to whatever our original goal was, and now that's not enough. We see people that are doing better than us. We change that goalpost. So we will likely lock ourselves into this unwinnable cycle. We just need to be aware that we're doing that. We need to sort of make ourselves aware that we might be playing into that dynamic. So if you're able to shift that perspective and then strengthen your sense of self and explore, you will find yourself prioritizing what really matters to you. This is kind of the biggest job. So we'll be able to discover what it is that is truly meaningful to you. These things, for most people, tend to be, for example, their family, their community, or a cause that's very dear to them. So by using this basic cognitive behavioral therapy techniques of testing our assumptions, and instead of accepting these automatic thoughts about how things ought to be, we're able to broaden our horizons. So we're being deliberate about this. If we do make the effort of being diligent and deliberate about it, we may discover a solid source of meaning and self-worth that will sustain us. So you can ask this process by asking yourself things like, you can start this process, I should have said, by asking yourself things like, why does it ought to be like this? Who says that it ought to be like that? What is it really based on? What is it coming from? Is it something that comes from me, or is it something that I've learned, some other people say, and I've kind of, taken on board? Are there any other points of view that I could consider? How do I know whether this thing that I'm using to measure my self-worth is right or wrong? How do I truly know is right or wrong? So that's one way to start questioning this ought to be way of thinking. The next thing is what I sort of started to talk about earlier. So you might think it's a bit corny, but I put up some questions there that actually probe the dimensions that seem to confer lasting self-value to people. Things that are sustainable through people's lifetimes. So they might sound a bit corny, but people in their 60s often tend to be happier than their younger selves, even though, on average, you might say that they don't look as good as they used to. And they might be retired, so they may have less money than they used to. And their professional life might have stopped or slowed down. But again, in surveys that consistently don't value the things that we think should be, we automatically use to judge ourselves, but they use other things like the lists, the things on this list, they value the kinds of attributes that you have here in themselves and in others. So think about how you would think of other people now, and how would you, I suppose, evaluate them? We shouldn't judge. We shouldn't evaluate people. But if you do it like a thought experiment for 2 seconds, would you prefer the company of people who answer yes to these questions that I put on the screen? Or the people who say yes to things like, are you getting many promotions at work? And they answer yes to that. Do you have a lot of money? And they answer yes to that. Do you have a fancy car? And they answer yes to that. Do you look good? And they answer yes to that. So who would you rather spend time with? People who are, for example, more compassionate, more that actually are able to sort of enjoy fun activities, people that develop skills and they become more insightful, more accepting, more patient, kinder, people who are good at making other people feel at ease, people who are dependable, people who are full of energy and energize others around them, people who are good at listening, people who make other people laugh. Who would you rather be with? I think that's an important way that you can ask yourself these questions and start to internalize them. And as I said, it's not just knowing, it's about finding a way to really adopt these new dimensions that we're going to use to measure ourselves up against. And as I said, there's not just one dimension, there's all these kinds of dimensions that we need to sort of be thinking about. Now, another source of poor self-esteem is the practice of self-labeling. So it's a kind of unhelpful self-talk or an automatic, we could also be calling it an automatic thought, self-talk or automatic thought. And it may come from having unrealistic expectations of ourselves, or, as I said before, impossible standards. You have to be good at your job, but also you have to be the best housekeeper ever. You have to be a good father, a good mother. You have to be able to homeschool your children. All of these things have to be done to perfection. So if the house is untidy, or you make a mistake at work, or you sort of, any of those plates that you are constantly juggling kind of drops a little bit, you immediately might label yourself a failure, inadequate, or you may even use crueler ways of labeling yourself. So it might also come from what we think others are like. And we think that it looks as if they are able to look amazing, juggle a million things, and get all the promotions and buy bigger cars and better houses and all of that. So we have this perception of others and that we feel that we may not measure up. And that means that we are, again, self-labeling, useless, hopeless, a mess, or what have you. We fail to realize that these people have a million problems themselves, and they also see themselves, they are telling themselves the same story. They are also labeling themselves in the same way. They might deem themselves a failure because they may know other people that they think are doing even better than them. And surprisingly, this other person that they are thinking of and they're comparing themselves against us might be us. So they might be themselves putting themselves down because they compare themselves against what they perceive we are doing, and that is a source of low self-esteem for them. And actually this happens much more commonly than you might think. So these labels may come from comparing ourselves to media standards, particularly social media. In social media, we may see portrayals of what people ought to do and ought to have. And if we don't compare to that idealized version, we start judging ourselves. If you start looking at the Instagram of the rich and famous and comparing what we think their lives are like to ours, well, that is the perfect way to start being very nasty to ourselves. Emily, I don't know if you had a comment about that. You said before.
Yeah, I was going to talk about social media, and that this is probably very relevant to people of a younger generation. I think children as young as 13, 12 have access to Instagram and social media, and it's really, really easy to get caught up and start to compare yourself to what you see on the profiles of people that you might look at and role model against. But it's also really important to remember that people only really portray the good things that happen on these kind of mediums, and it's really, really easy to get a false sense of what someone's life might be like and get distracted by that, and not really having what you were talking about earlier with that more awareness of your situation and, you know, what is realistic for me and what is valuable to me, rather than looking at people that have a completely different lifestyle to us. So I think the social media is a really, really key contributor to that, especially in this day and age.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's why I made a particular emphasis in it. So how do we deal with self-labeling that we've been talking about, and where and its sources? We need to sort of start by figuring out how to replace these labels. So the problem with this self-labeling is that it can become such a habit and so deeply ingrained into us that we don't even notice that we're doing it. So we believe the nasty label that we have given ourselves, and it starts doing the real damage. So here again, basic cognitive behavioral skill of identifying these nasty thoughts comes first. So just identifying them is a win, because some people, or a lot of people, the majority of people, I would say, don't even realize that they're doing this self-labeling that we've been talking about. They just feel that that is natural, or that is real, or that is, they take it for granted. They don't even question it. So just actually visualizing it, sort of realizing that you're doing it, is the first step. So then, instead of assuming the validity, instead of believing them, we must seriously question them and determine whether there's any truth in them or not. And even if there is some truth in them, is that a useful way to look at ourselves or not? Is that something that is going to help us grow and develop or not? If not, there might be other ways that are equally true of looking at it that are more helpful. So once we have done that, we might be able to start replacing those labels with more helpful ones. And this is not about deluding ourselves or lying to ourselves or doing anything like that at all. It's actually looking at those labels and realizing that they are not real, they have some fundamental flaws, and replacing them for more helpful, more accurate ones, in fact. So here's how that might look like. So I put a list up here of very common unhelpful labels that we might give ourselves when we're being really nasty to ourselves. So things like, I'm inadequate, I'm weak, I'm no good, I'm a failure. So again, you might not even be aware that you're calling yourself these names automatically under the surface. It's about identifying them first, but once you have, then you have to question them. And you have to sort of say, okay, am I really inadequate for everything, in every situation? Am I weak all the time for everybody, compared to everything? Is that an absolute? Is that true in every dimension of life? So please take a moment to look through these common labels we give ourselves. If any of those labels ring even a faint bell for you, you might want to be on the lookout for when it happens. And when it happens, you need to start questioning it. So the big giveaway of these thoughts is that they're always black and white. As I was saying earlier, I'm inadequate. It's an absolute statement. Now think, is that ever true for anybody? Is anybody ever always inadequate in all aspects of their life? People always have redeeming qualities and things that are valuable to others, always. Nobody's always inadequate in all dimensions. You know, even the most extreme cases, you can always find some kind of a redeeming quality of some sort. Hence, the more useful thought is acknowledging, the more useful label is acknowledging that we do possess some skills and talents, we're not inadequate in all aspects. So that's why the proposed helpful alternative is to realize that that we're not inadequate for everything. We do have some skills and talents. We have both strengths and weaknesses. We have many good qualities. We're capable of both success and failure. We can all do stupid things sometimes, like many others. But sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. And we do use many useful things, even though sometimes we don't do useful things. So what? So basically, those helpful alternatives, as you can see, none of them is absolute. They're all nuanced, and they're all relative, and they all look for, they all look at ourselves as multidimensional people, not just one-dimensional. I'm a failure in this particular domain, therefore I'm a failure in all domains. That is the thought that pops into our head. That is the negative self-talk that pops into our head that we need to be on the watch out for and actually question, as I was saying. So the intellectual exercise of applying a more realistic, less black and white label is a useful one, but we also want to achieve the emotional state of being happy with ourselves. For that, we just need to go one step further, which is about accepting ourselves, as we said at the beginning. So none of us is perfect, and self-acceptance does not mean having anything in ourselves that we wouldn't change. In fact, wanting to change things and improve our lives is perfectly healthy and actually quite helpful. One of the first things to do is formulate our goals for self-improvement. And it's important to identify what I'm calling here ultimate goals and not intermediate ones, not be confused by the intermediate goals. So what do I mean? So for example, if we say that we want a higher salary, that is a goal without a real objective. Yeah, that sounds to me like one of those scorekeeping goals. We can always find somebody with higher salary. Okay, so we can always try to have a higher salary, and there will be people better off than we are. However, if you want to have a higher salary so that you can help your children with the university tuition fees, well, that's a very different matter. You're doing it because your real goal is to be a good parent. So the real goal here, the ultimate goal, is to be a good parent. So being a good parent is a goal that you'll never regret having. Never. So also it will help you clarify things like how much harder should you work to get that extra money. If working harder means spending almost no time with your children, then are you not really defeating your ultimate goal of being a good parent? So you will clarify that for yourself by having this clear, sustainable, ultimate goal. So those are the kinds of goals that will help you find meaning and self-worth for the duration of your life. And again, things that you can look back on and you will feel proud of. I was a good parent. I was a good father. I was a good community member. I was a good mother. I was a good, I was good to my own parents when they were elderly. Things like that. You will never regret having those. So it's okay to have those intermediate goals so long as they are in the service of an ultimate goal that is sustainable, that is going to be meaningful, and is not one of those scorekeeping goals. That's kind of the thing to be watchful for. So the next job when we are trying to improve ourselves is, once we clarify these goals and we know what is truly worthwhile for us, not trying forever to beat some kind of score, then we can work on improving ourselves. So imagine that, for example, you want to get better at your job in pursuit of some of those ultimate goals that I've just mentioned. So you first need to be realistic about what can be achieved in what period of time. So here you might set yourself impossible standards. This is another one of those pitfalls, and you find yourself constantly dissatisfied. If that happens, you should review your timeline and your goal and not beat yourself up about not performing as you expected to, because obviously the initial way you formulated that goal and the timeline was completely unrealistic, and it's just going to be a source of pain and suffering. What you need to do is accept those limitations and reformulate your goals based on them. So imagine now that okay, your goal is to be better at your job in service of one of those ultimate goals, and you make a mistake at work. Because getting better at work has become so important to you, again, you may lose track of your ultimate goal. This can happen. So yeah, anyway, you got lost in that. You're beating yourself up about making that mistake, and you're thinking about it, and it's keeping you up all night, and it's stressing you out. You may start, without meaning to, giving yourself those nasty labels. You may start thinking about what you ought to have done and dwell on it, calling yourself horrible things. Every time the thought pops into your head, you go through around that cycle. What should I have done instead? Why do I have to be this stupid? Why can't I get it right? All of these things, they're all horrible to you and very unhelpful, and they're not going to get you any further in achieving that goal that you formed for yourself. The best way to deal with this situation is to see these mistakes and accept that we will inevitably make them while we're trying to improve ourselves, because they are a part of learning. So when you learn to write, you made a ton of mistakes. We all did. The point was to practice and make those mistakes so that they could be pointed out, and that's how we eventually learned. That's how we eventually were able to read and write. This is the same for any skill. So if you're not making mistakes, you're not learning. The important thing is not to blame yourself, but to appraise what went wrong, and that's fine. So what went wrong, how will you learn from it, and what will you do next time? That way you can see yourself as a person that is forever getting better and improving, rather than as a person that is making mistakes and failing. So you are learning and improving yourself. You're not a failure. That's kind of, is actually true. So it's not that we're making this up. This is how progress happens, by learning from what we got wrong the day before, not by blaming ourselves for it. That's not a way to make progress. So how can we do this? So what you see on the screen now is a list of the questions that you may want to use on yourself whenever you realize that you are having a go at yourself. Okay, so the best way to do this is to write these questions down along with your answers. Feels like a lot of work, I know, but is the way it works best. It's fine doing it on your phone, but you can also use a piece of paper, it's fine. The point of writing it down is to enable your brain to truly process the information. Is making that jump from something that you nebulously, you in the abstract, to making it real for you, to making it something that you're going to live your life according to. So that act of deliberately writing out your thoughts helps also clarify them. The last question is perhaps the most important. This last one, what have I learned from this experience? What have I learned from making this mistake? I mean, there's other questions before them that are equally important, because it might not have been preventable. And we blamed ourselves, but it might not have been preventable. It might not have been all our fault. They might be partially our fault, but there were partially other circumstances that contributed to it. We also acknowledge that. We may have made a mistake. We just need to learn from it. What was acceptable about it? Was it a horrible, horrible experience, like you said, or there were things that went well, even though it didn't go exactly like we wanted? Is appraising it carefully. Realistically, I'm not saying give yourself any passes. We're learning, we're giving ourselves good feedback, and we're using this to learn. It's just that, we need to realize that we will make these mistakes. It's just we need to be on the watch out for how we learn. Now, as we practice this, eventually we won't need to write it down or do anything. We will immediately process any mistakes in this way. Instead of saying, what an idiot I am because I didn't do this right, we will jump immediately to, okay, we made a mistake, that's fine. What can we do differently? What can we learn from this for the next time? And that would be, A, it will help improve ourselves, and also B, we won't be blaming ourselves and beating ourselves up about it. So we will learn to stop this spiraling into self-criticism after every setback. And that is kind of one of the most important things. And it create an instinct for looking for lessons in anything that we attempt and foster that growth mentality that we want to develop. So I hope those questions are useful. And as I said, I recommend writing them out. Okay, we're done. I want to recap what we've learned just very quickly. So in this seminar, we have covered how harmful it can be to see ourselves in black and white terms and to collapse our whole personal growth a whole personal worth to a scorekeeping type of dimension like looks, money, fame, social standing, etc. To counteract that tendency, we must work on building a full picture of ourselves and realize that we have many different dimensions and many ways of finding meaning and worth, rather than rely on the defaults that come from perhaps our upbringing, our society, or most poignantly, as Emily was saying, social media. We discussed how we have a tendency to give ourselves horrible labels and how this can be completely automatic and invisible by using cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that they don't need to be used in therapy. We can use them in everyday life. These techniques can help us make the labels more transparent, see that they are unrealistic, they are absolute statements which are not true, and replace them with more accurate, more helpful ones that will help us grow. We discussed how accepting ourselves does not mean that we don't want to improve. In fact, a good way to improve our self-esteem is to improve along the dimensions that are important to us once we've clarified them, and sort of see what is meaningful to us in the long term. All the people in interviews never regret spending too little time in the office. They regret things like not devoting themselves to their families. They regret things like not being better members of the community. They regret those kind of things. So we have short, mid-term goals that might be of the score-keeping kind. We need to make sure that they are aligned with a worthwhile long-term goal that avoids that keeping up with the Joneses mentality that is very harmful. And finally, we discuss how to stop beating ourselves up when things go wrong and how to shift to a growth mentality when we know that things will go wrong, sorry, as I wanted to say, but we will learn from those and we will be able to sort of face those mistakes better and get better over time. We're not failures because we failed. We're all learners with opportunities to thrive. And with that, I think we'll open it up for questions and see what people want to ask about.
We haven't had any Q&As as yet, so I might just give people a couple of minutes.
I think there's some comments on the chat.
Just a couple, but it was more technical.
Oh, more technical, okay. All
yeah.
right. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so if anybody has any questions.
Just while we're waiting for anyone to type anything, if this is the first webinar that you've been on from us, the way to get the recording is it will be sent to you via your Eventbrite registration link. So we will upload it onto our YouTube channel and we'll send it out in the next 24 hours, I'd say. But we've also got all of the other webinars that we've done over the last few weeks on our webinar channel as well on YouTube.
Yeah, well, it seems that I did a very good job of being very clear there.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you for everybody for the comments. You know, telling us that it was a good webinar. Oh, there's a question. There's a couple of questions now.
All right. So first question is: would you recommend recording these thought processes, like keeping a journal of self-esteem?
Yes, as I said, it's perfectly reasonable to do this in our heads. However, the best way to do it and the best benefit is always obtained when you're actually writing these things down. And the reason for that is that the brain seems to process the information more deeply if we make the effort to write it down and we reflect on it while doing it. Just the act of writing it down helps us clarify it and makes it more concrete and we're able to sort of do a better job of actually targeting those thoughts, and the whole process becomes much easier for us to learn long term. So I would definitely recommend using a journal, but perhaps even using those questions that I mentioned before to clarify these things. Or when we have a label, writing out the realistic label against it. So when we've identified one of those safe labeling things, just writing out the realistic label against it.
Yeah. The next one, what do you do if your manager is not so sympathetic to learning from mistakes?
I think that's a good one for you, because you're a business psychologist. So this is very much about, this is the absolute right. I mean, your manager should. But let's hear from Emily. Yeah.
I think, I think this is a big challenge, and I think the key here is that yes, there are going to be situations where you have a manager that doesn't necessarily have all of the characteristics of a good and supportive manager, and that can make learning from mistakes quite difficult, because you will start to fear making mistakes because of how that person will react. I think in this situation it's quite difficult, really, because you can't necessarily change someone else's behavior, and it can also be really easy to start getting yourself worked up about how someone else will respond to a situation, which is again largely out of your control. So I suppose a simple way of addressing that is actually trying to have a talk with your manager, and maybe framing it in a way where you're sort of wanting to get some advice on improvement. So it might be, how can I do better? Or if I look back at what I've done over the last 6 months, can we work out some ways that maybe I can improve, or have some targets, and talk through those mistakes maybe with your manager in that way. And you're kind of giving them a bit more of the control to give you some feedback. But also, they might not realize that their response to a mistake or something that you've done is having this effect on you. And I think a lot of managers will be quite surprised to learn that is how it's being portrayed, and they won't want it to be portrayed in that way. So sometimes simply just having an open conversation with your manager, if you have that relationship with them, or if you feel comfortable doing so, can really start to open up that line of communication. But there's not a clear-cut answer there, unfortunately, because every dynamic is different and people are going to respond in slightly different ways. But I think there's a few things there that you can sort of do practically for yourself, but also realise that there are going to be times where you won't have full control over the way that someone responds. So I hope that was helpful, and I don't know whether Andreas has anything else.
Yeah, just a quick one. So yes, you cannot control what they are going to do. I mean, they should definitely do what Emily recommended and listen to it, and actually it will be good for them as a manager, as well as for the company as a whole, to be fostering that growth mentality culture. But nonetheless, you can do things for yourself. You know that even though the manager is not responding in the best possible way, you don't need to internalize his attitude. You can be thinking about, okay, take yourself through those questions and appreciate, even though the boss might have, like, for example, blamed you for the whole thing. Is that true? Is that not true? Clarify it for yourself and see, you keep your own growth mentality going. And that even though they might have blamed you, they were wrong to do so, or there were lessons for you to learn, even they didn't articulate, they didn't help you, or they didn't sit down with you and help you articulate those. You can do that for yourself and not necessarily be so much at the mercy in that respect. There's other things that you cannot control, but that your response to it and how you think of it for yourself, you can.
Yeah. And I think it also comes back to that almost setting impossible goals for yourself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some people are actually in a position where maybe they are a bit out of their depth, and that is down to, I suppose, partly the individual for pushing yourself, and that is completely fine. But it can also have a negative effect if you are setting yourself goals or challenges that might be outside of your current skill set, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So if you feel like you are, you know, letting other people down, or that you're constantly getting pulled up for mistakes, then it might have to be include a bit of self-reflection, and maybe talking to your team about, you know, is this the right role, or is there something I can be doing slightly differently, or just having that awareness.
Do you need some training? Do you need some resources that you haven't been made available to you? Mm-hmm. Those are, you know, so again, if you take yourself through those questions, you may analyze the situation and realize that you may not be, you know, it's not really all your fault. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have the training, if you don't have those things, how is it your fault? You know, if you're willing to learn and you're working your hardest, and you are, you know, making honest mistakes and learning from them, then you should not feel bad about yourself. I would say that emphatically. It's more that, you know, the circumstances are whatever they are. So you have to be realistic about them and not set yourself up impossible goals. Because your team might not, I think there was a question about, you know, feeling out of your depth, etc., and how others might perceive you in the office. Well, they might not perceive you that way. You don't know. It may be that you're setting up yourself impossible goals that you should. I was talking about the time frames earlier in the seminar, and they might not be realistic. You know, that you might not be expecting yourself. You're expecting yourself to learn everything in, I don't know, 3 weeks, when actually it might take people 3 months to learn whatever it is that you're trying to learn. Or it might take you 3 months, it doesn't matter. So therefore, you need to reformulate what is realistic in terms of those expectations. And it might be that it takes 3 months to learn. And why should you be feeling bad about yourself because it takes 3 months to learn it for you? There's no, you need to sort of question, why is that entangled with your self-worth? That's kind of the question to ask yourself.
We've got another good question, which I think is very relevant to this topic. How do you get over the imposter scenario? So someone might find me out that I'm not a good whatever I am, a HR officer, for example.
Sure.
I think that's a really good question, and I think
you should answer it, Emily, because
I would say that it comes down to really asking yourself those questions and collecting evidence. So collecting evidence for that question, that, you know, well, what is the evidence to say that you aren't good? And you usually then find that there's more evidence that works in your favor against that belief. You know, if you're in a position, you're there for a reason, and you might not know everything, but as Andreas was saying, the whole process of learning is not fully understanding everything at the point of starting it, making mistakes and learning from those. And that is actually what underpins a lot of motivation as well, because if you have the opportunity to learn and progress and build your skills, then you're going to be more motivated to do the job versus someone that just steps into a role and knows everything that they're doing in that moment. That's what I would say. Andreas, have you got anything?
No, and I also think that you might be measuring yourself with some kind of an impossible person that really doesn't exist, that is absolutely 100% competent, knows all the policies, all the procedures like the back of their hand, and has like 1,000,000 years of experience, and you're not there yet. But that doesn't make you a bad HR officer. You know, I think the question is specifically about being a HR officer. It means that you are one that is constantly, so long as you have the best interest of the people that you serve at heart, you know that you're going to make an effort to serve them well, and you know that you're going to keep learning, you know, and to be open about these things with your colleagues. You shouldn't feel like an imposter. I mean, most people that feel, I mean, most of us will feel as an imposter at one time or another. You know, we need to sort of realize this. But it is more of a realization that we've made up this impossible picture, this unattainable picture of what a good HR officer is like. And we're measuring up ourselves against this fiction, and we're coming up short. But that's not the reality. We need to form a realistic picture of what a good HR officer is. And, you know, we may be honest with ourselves, and we may, you know, not be there yet, but so what? So long as we are making those things that we talked about, we are we're appraising ourselves correctly, we are learning from our mistakes, and we are doing the best that we can to serve these people. So the most important thing is, are you doing a good job for those people that you're serving, as good as you can? An honest, good, caring job. That's going to make you feel good about yourself.
Next one is, how, as a parent, can I create this type of environment for my child?
Oh yeah, so that's a very good question. I think is that growth mentality, you know, cultivating those. So children sometimes tend to, I mean, I think one of the worries is exposure to social media. So I think you need to contextualize that for them in the best way you can, by perhaps pointing out the things that Emily was pointing out earlier, that these people are portraying an idealized version of their lives. That doesn't mean that their lives are like that at all. And also helping the children. Children will come up with these values that we were talking about for themselves if you let them. So if you ask them the questions, so instead of lecturing them, you ask them, you know, why is that important? You know, okay, why is having a lot of money important? What does that do? And how much money is enough money? And how do you know? And what happens if you find somebody that has more money than you? Would that be important? Is that the thing that you really care about? The children might, you know, if you allow them to explore these concepts, they might, you know, you might allow them to realize that those are empty constructs, that they, you know, they will yield no real value long term. So I think having those discussions with them about what they really value and what they should really value and what they should really care about, to explore them for themselves, not to accept ones that come from the outside. Again, warn them that this happens, that they will be exposed to these people that believe these things, and perhaps they shouldn't take them for granted, and that they should be a little bit skeptical about them and interrogate them for themselves to see whether they stand up or they don't, and help them do that little bit of Socratic questioning for themselves. How do we know that this is the right thing? Why do we say that this ought to be the way? Are there any other ways? Can we find examples of people that live in a different way? And is it any less valuable? What do we really care about? Yeah, and point to them like more helpful role models. That might be a good way to sort of contrast it as well. Yeah.
We've just got one. I'm looking at the time there, so I appreciate some people might have to dash. We just have one more question, which we'll answer. And how can you move on from making a big mistake in your eyes from years ago that still haunts you and you still feel others remember, even if they probably don't?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think the clue is in the question, isn't it? So
in your eyes.
In your eyes, exactly. So you need to evaluate whether it was really such a big mistake. What were the actual consequences of it? Again, was it preventable? Was it not? So again, by using the questions that we were thinking and writing it out, it might be a helpful way to go about it. So describe the event. What didn't I like about my particular performance? Was there a way to prevent it, really, that I could have enacted? Did it fail, or did you make a mistake? And how realistically big that was a mistake? By writing it out, you will be processing this information. How much of it was really your fault? Was there what was there that was acceptable about that event? What would you do differently now? And what have you learned? I think you need to ask those questions to yourself, and see what you come up with. So you're also worried about how this might be perceived by others. And again, I think you do a very good job of reflecting on this for yourself. They probably don't. And that's probably what's going. So you already started on the thought process. You're not giving enough credence to the last bit. So what is the evidence that it was a big mistake that has lasting consequences years down the line? Really? Could I have prevented it? Could I learn from it? I mean, maybe it was a big mistake, but you've learned from it, and now it's not going to happen again because you're better, or it's less likely to happen again because you're much better equipped. And actually, you're there for your experience. And actually, if something similar happens now, it's great that they will have you on board because you will help them avoid a mistake similar to that. So just having the experience of going through something going quite badly is quite valuable. And it will be valuable for others. That experience of getting things wrong and learning what the solution was will be something that your colleagues, your younger colleagues, new colleagues will value from you. So I think you need to sort of think about what was valuable about that, what you learned, and what you can use now from that mistake that will help your colleagues, that will prevent your colleagues from having similar problems. No, I think you need to sort of go through that process. Yeah.
And also, I guess, setting yourself standards that you would hold to other people. So you might be giving yourself more of a hard time than if you were to step back and someone else making the same mistake. Would you have the same view of them? Would you forgive them? Would you hold them accountable? So it's again taking a step back and seeing, are you giving yourself unrealistic expectations and holding yourself to a much higher expectation than someone else?
Is that perfectionism that, you know, I need to be perfect all the time, that is, you know, it's impossible. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we'll stop there.
Yeah, I think we'll stop there.
Yeah,
well, thank you very much for logging on today. We'll send the recording round.
And thanks for all your questions.
Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.